Welcome to Flat, Cool, and Acid Free, an OK State Archives podcast, bringing you stories about Oklahoma State University and Oklahoma. I'm Nina Thornton, multimedia producer for the OSU Libraries. On this episode,
Bennett is a part of a group of gentlemen who travel to Europe to work over there.
Samantha Mackey and David Peters talk about international programs at OSU.
Beginning in the 1950s, we began looking at the possibility of extending that land-grant model of education, research, and extension into other parts of the world. And we became actively involved in a number of different locations. Africa, Asia, and South America predominated.
Cool. So President Bennett on campus, he did a lot for the architecture and stuff, but what kind of impact did he have on the international programs?
So right after World War II, Bennett is a part of a group of gentlemen who traveled to Europe to work over there on the recovery of Europe after the war. And so we got to tour a lot of Central and Eastern Europe. And he came back with the realization there were a lot of things we could do in the world to help others. And not only in Europe, but he really felt a strong desire to help in the developing world. And part of that is reflected in the fact that there was a concern about the dramatic increase in the communist influence after World War II. And so this was a way to combat both the communist influence in the developing world, but also to spread the land-grant mission to other places. And so Bennett is named director of the Point Four program in about 1949, 1950. He's the first director of the Point Four program. And this is a program that Harry S. Truman had actually mentioned in his inaugural address of 1948. And so Truman mentions this proposal, and within a short time he names Bennett as the first director. And now Bennett travels the world, Asia, Africa, South America, Central America, looking at possibilities for partnerships and cooperation with local, state, regional, city projects that will help the people in those areas. Tragically, Bennett is killed while on a Point Four mission. They were in the Middle East. It was at Christmas, December 1951. His wife Vera had traveled with him on that trip because she wanted to see the Holy Land. And then other members of the Point Four team that were with him perished in a plane crash near Tehran, Iran. Bennett, during that year and a half, would continue to come back to campus and was sharing the stories of what he was doing and really kind of inspiring people to consider more involvement overseas. And so he acted as an official representative for the U.S. government, but he was also making sure that individuals at Oklahoma A&M were aware of what was going on and looking at possibilities for them too. And eventually that gets us into Ethiopia.
So, David, when did OSU first get international students?
So the first one I could find was in 1899. So just a few years after we founded the college, a young man from Turkey, and I believe his name is Avidas Ajiman, but I'm don't force me to say it again. But he had gone to college in Massachusetts. And then the Turkish government sponsored him on a tour of the central United States. And so he attended classes for a short time at Kansas A&M. We now know it as Kansas State University. And then he came down here for a semester or two and took classes here as a part of this tour. So he is the first international student that I know of. And it's kind of hard to tell early on, but the first one that I'm aware of. But then, near as I can tell, the first student who graduated, who was an international student, was a gentleman from Japan, and his name was Yutaka Akoji, and he graduated in 1912 in dairy science. His hope was to go back to Japan and open up a creamery, and I'm not sure how he made the connection to OSU, but he had served as a journalist during the Russo-Japanese War. And so he had some exposure to the world at that point, but eventually made his way to Oklahoma about 1908, 1909, and then graduated with the class of 1912.
So what kind of programs were in place to help these international students adjust to life in Stillwater, Oklahoma?
Well, there were several. Early on, there was in 1921, there was an international relations committee, and so they would encourage interactions with international students. There was also called a Cosmopolitan Club, That was also a small group, but they helped international students make some of the transitions to American culture, society, social norms, food. So those were two of the earlier ones. Later, there was a community hospitality club that also encouraged interaction with international students. And then many of the Stillwater civic and service groups and churches had active programs working with international students. And so it really was a combined effort from a number of different groups and organizations and individuals to work with these students when they came over here. I was very surprised actually to know there were that many groups that were concerned with international students and helping them make the transitions to the American educational system.
So, one of the things on campus that serves as kind of a visible and tangible reminder of OSU's international outreach is International Mall. How did International Mall come to be?
So in 1965, Bill Moyer, who was a kind of a political analyst, and had worked for Lyndon Johnson, so he's also a national commentator. Bill Moyer comes and makes a presentation on campus, and he expresses a desire, a wish that OSU would do something to acknowledge President Bennett's efforts in the Point Four program. And OSU started thinking about that. We had a new president, Dr. Kalm, came in 65, 66. And so he charged a committee led by Bill Abbott, William Abbott. Dr. Abbott was head of the international programs at the time, to create some kind of plan for an international monument or international plaza on the campus. They looked at several sites and eventually decided on a site just north of the library. And at the time, it still had temporary buildings left from World War II. And after World War II, there were Quonset huts and sheds and kind of temporary structures. Mm-hmm. Well, they got those cleared out. And then they began working on a plan for how to develop the area. And so you have, you have the library on the south, and you have the physical sciences on the west, and engineering north is on the east. So that's kind of the quad around the site. But they had real issues with drainage from that area. And so they spent most of their budget actually on creating a drainage system to clear that area. And so if people who are familiar with the International Mall, but there's these large grates that allow for drainage when heavy rains occur. And when you have super heavy rains, there's still a backup of water. But anyway, they have this large drainage system. That took most of the budget. So what they did, though, is there was a plan by Brian Thompson, who was the landscape architect for the campus at the time, horticulture graduate, horticulture student from here. He had kind of a formal plan with hedges and shrubbery and much like the gardens in front of the student union. But the students at the time said they really preferred something open that would be more inclusive for people. It wouldn't restrict people's movement from place to place. You could have large gatherings of people on that mall area. And so they actually end up going with the kind of open plan with a few plantings, a few trees, and then pathways to get kind of diagonally through that area. But it was kind of a work in progress. So it had initially been proposed in 1965. It really isn't dedicated until I think it was April or May of 1971, so it took a while to get to that point. And then they continued to have additions to it. International students sponsored the production of a sculpture out of marble. There's a dove. It was a peace dove sitting on top of the globe. And I think that was installed about 1972. Also in 72, they installed the flag poles that are at the north end of the plaza of the mall area. That's before the Noble Research Center was built. So there was just those 19 flag poles. The one flagpole has the U.S. flag and the Oklahoma flag, and then the other 18 flagpoles, they rotate through flags from the countries that represent the students who are currently international students on campus. So it took a period of time for this thing to kind of develop. Eventually a plaque was added acknowledging OSU's efforts in Ethiopia. We had worked very closely with Haile Selassie to develop a college in Ethiopia, and we ended up having three sites in Ethiopia. But there was a large plaque presented or produced and supported by Emperor Haile Selassie to be at the International Mall. Several other plaques have come and gone. The dove has been stolen 2 or 3 times. This last time they replaced it with a bronze replica, and I guess they're able to adhere it to secure it more securely to the stand. But that's how it all got started in the late 60s and early 70s. but to acknowledge, first of all, the impact of Dr. Bennett on international programs, and then the impact that international students have had on our campus and visiting here, and let them know that they're welcome. Just a week or two ago, they had lunch, and you could get all kinds of different flavors of international food in that international mall, which I think is a great location for them to hold that event. So anyway, probably said too much, but that's a little bit about the international mall.
So William wants to know, how many different countries are represented at OSU?
At times there have been more than 50 or 60. So early on, in the first decades, you'd have just a handful. And at different periods of time, different groups, different parts of the world have been represented. At one time, we had a lot of students from Nigeria. At other times, we had a lot of students from Ethiopia because of our connections with Ethiopia. We've had a lot of students from India and Pakistan and China at different points in time. I would say at any one time, though, at least now, we probably should check with international programs and we can get back once we get the information from them. But I would say 50 to 60 countries at least are represented. And they make up, international students make up sometimes up to 8 to 10% of our total student population. So there's a significant portion of our students are international students. I'd guess 50 or 60, but I'll find out.
Okay. Bonnie said that she said, I've heard different stories about why we fly certain flags on international lawn. How do they choose the flags that fly?
So they're cycled through. And so let's say at the beginning of that semester, they'll select the flags from the countries for international students that are here, and they simply go in a rotation. And so the U.S. flag and Oklahoma flag are always there, but then the other flagpoles, it's simply a rotation through. And so they're up for so long, and they get rotated out, and new ones come in. And so that way, it's not like a random drawing or selective by who we like best or who has the most students from that country. They simply go through in a cycle, and so eventually every student's flag should be represented at the flagpole at several points during the semester.
Sarah would like to know, when did Haile Selassie visit Stillwater, and was he able to see it?
Yes. Well, he came, I believe it was about 1954 or 55. I could be off a little bit. And this was after Bennett had passed, but the emperor had expressed a strong desire to come to OSU. He had met with Bennett when Bennett was leading the .4 program. So he had met with Bennett about 1949, 1950. But he comes here. I think it was really the first visit by an emperor to North America. I could be wrong about that too, but it was highly unusual for someone to travel of his status. But he wanted to come here to celebrate the efforts that OSU, Oklahoma A&M had been involved with in Ethiopia with Alamaya, and so they had quite a ceremony. He arrives in an Ethiopian airline. A lot of dignitaries across the United States, from the State Department, governor, local state dignitaries. They had a banquet, presentations. He spent the night at the Student Union Hotel. He had quite a large entourage that traveled with him. So it was quite an event. And then after the banquet, he met with surviving members of the Bennett family, and they really appreciated the kind of a quality moment they had with him. I've heard stories of him holding some of the grandchildren of Bennett on his knee, and just interacting with the family. And so he was very appreciative of Oklahoma A&M's efforts in Ethiopia, and just wanted to connect with this location and with many of the people that had been involved with that. So I'm guessing 54 or 55, but we'll find out exactly when that is too, and we can correct me later on. So,
Great.
But appreciate the question. Thank you.
Anthony asks if we have any programs like the 4-point program now.
The .4 program?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Now that's known as the Agency for International Development, and it's still a very active agency for the United States government in all parts of the world, and it's done some marvelous work around the world. But the Agency for International Development grew out of the .4 program, and AID, Agency for International Development, is very collaborative with a number of other international aid groups. So they'll work with the World Food Program, they'll work with Peace Corps volunteers, they'll work with a lot of different UNESCO, United Nations, they'll work with anybody almost to help increase educational opportunities, economic development, and especially health activities around the world. And so, yeah, AID is still very active and is a part of our federal government.
One last question before we go. Can you tell us a little bit about Stillwater's sister city in Japan?
So, beginning in the 80s, there was a program to connect states with prefectures. Prefectures are kind of like states in Japan. And so Oklahoma was created a sister state relationship with Kyoto. Kyoto is a prefecture in Japan. So Oklahoma and Kyoto create this sister state relationship. A short time after that, Stillwater creates a sister cities response or relationship with Kamioko, which is a large city in the Kyoto prefecture. At the same time, the English Language Institute at OSU is teaching English classes to Japanese students. And so they get involved too. And I believe it was a mayor of Kyoto who came to the United States, began exploring the idea of us creating an environment in Japan where students could begin some of their English language studies there and then transition here. So they'd get kind of a jump start on their language skills over there. And so about 1987, 88, there's this proposal to create a college or a small institute, I guess. I'm not sure what the exact terminology is, in Kamioko, working closely with OSU for these Japanese students to try to create this conduit to link them. And I think it was finally approved here by about 89. Let's see what I have a note here someplace. Okay, and so they started classes in 1990, and by 1991 they had dedicated a campus there. And I do have one picture, actually two pictures of the campus. Here's the campus in Kamioka, in the Kyoto prefecture. But it's a mountainous area, so it doesn't look anything really like Stillwater. It's a very lovely site. And we sent, I think Neil Hackett, Dr. Hackett was in the history department. We sent a group over to Kamioko. Tim Huff, who's currently still involved with international programs, he and his wife were there. There were a number of individuals from OSU who went then to work at this campus and make the transition, which I think is kind of interesting. This building at the center, for those of you who are familiar with OSU, looks just like Old Central. They made a copy of Old Central in Kamioko, and it's where the library was located. So their library was located in a building that looks exactly like Old Central. And so they really wanted to tie to us here, and for their students who attended English classes and other classes there, when they would come here, they could immediately identify their library with our oldest existing academic building. So it really was a quality relationship. And so the relationship isn't as formalized anymore, but the city of Stillwater still has this sister city interaction with Kamioko. And there's a garden, formal garden area in front of the, used to be the old junior high school, the Stillwater Community Center. I think those gardens are a part of a formal garden that's maintained in part from materials and stuff from Kamioko. So,
this segment was a part of the Archives Live, a monthly video broadcast on the Archives Facebook page. Join us there to ask questions, share your stories, and see photos from the OSU archival collections. This episode was hosted by Nina Thornton and produced by Samantha Mackey. Theme music is It's a Process, composed by Ben Stone and Finley Green, and published by BBC Production Music, PRS. From the folks at Oklahoma State University Libraries and the Archives, thanks for listening, and always remember to keep your archival material flat, cool, and acid-free.